Hello and welcome to Danos' Pathways to Success video series. My name is Penny Parker. Today's podcast will be focused on ESG and in particular, what does it mean in practical terms for lawyers? I'm joined today by James Sinclair. James is the head of ESG Consulting at FSI Worldwide. James, thank you so much for your time and welcome to the series. I thought we could start, and for all of our viewers, if maybe you could give us an intro into yourself and your background to date.
I started practicing law as a barrister. I qualified in 2001. And spent 5 or 6 years in private practice in London and then in Jersey in the Channel Islands. And then my career took a very sort of distinctive turn to go into what we would now call the ESG space. It wasn't really called that then, but very much into the idea of sustainable business practices. That was sort of 2006 through to now. I cross-qualified as a solicitor during that process because it made more sense. I was doing more solicitor type work. What I'm doing with the ESG consulting business at FSI is trying to work with our clients to see basically 4 things. So their top line strategy, what is the business doing and how is it doing it most effectively or not in terms of ESG. Thinking about specific policies and how to create and then integrate those policies into the business. Things like audit and sort of self-reflection, and then finally communication. So those are the 4 elements of what we're doing, and some of that involves lawyering. Most of it actually involves more sort of strategy and policy and communication.
Awesome. And just to go into more of a sort of a technical question now, but would you say we're moving from a regime of voluntary ESG disclosures towards mandatory due diligence? And if so, how profound a shift is that for ESG lawyers and their clients?
There's 2 big topics for me at the moment. One is this sort of mandatory human rights due diligence shift. The other is standardization and taxonomy. There's sort of a quite neat transition going on here. So what I would say the 2010s, we began with the UN guiding principles and sort of moved through the Modern Slavery Act and the various other sorts of bits of legislation and case law. That was one fairly defined period in which we saw the beginnings of this transition, this commercial transition to seeing sustainability more broadly, understanding that actually, whether it's investors or insurers or lawyers or whoever, that we cannot see business purely as a sort of thing that gets done, and then sustainability is a kind of nice to have add-on. And so that 10 years was very much about voluntary disclosures, codes of practice, compliance with laws, but the laws were not really, like the Modern Slavery Act is a perfect example of a reporting law. So larger companies are required to report on what they're doing, but actually in terms of auditing what they're really doing, there's not a whole lot of enforcement going on there. This move into the sort of the 2020s, which is very much this idea of mandatory due diligence, kind of has its roots in the Bribery Act, actually Section 7 of the Bribery Act, which is a failure to prevent type provision. And so we're seeing more of this kind of evolution where the responsibility is now passed to the company to be doing active and consistent due diligence on their supply chains and their operations, and that there will be penalties attached for failing to do that, with potentially the reversal or partial reversal of the burden of proof on those companies. So just as it is with bribery and corruption, if sort of misdeeds are found in your business or your supply chain, it is for you to demonstrate that you had in place sufficient policies to deal with that. That seems to be the way that the law is evolving in relation to mandatory human rights due diligence. And that, of course, involves a whole range of things. So when we talk about ESG, obviously environmental, social, and governance, this is essentially sustainable business practices writ large. So whether it's environmental sustainability, labor rights, corporate governance, all of this stuff goes into the package. And if we are seeing a move towards more sort of stringent laws, which are more robustly enforced, I think that's definitely phase 2, which we're entering now.
What do you think are the key issues or challenges for lawyers working in the ESG space?
This taxonomy issue. How do you define what is and is not a sustainable business? And the EU is doing a lot of work on that at the moment. And then there's this question, how do you avoid the allegation of greenwashing and all of that, which I think is all built up with that. And finally, I would say that we mustn't forget the S and the G. There's sort of the Cinderellas in this, are the social and the governance side. The environmental aspect is definitely leading here. But that we also have to have a care about the broader stakeholders, particularly in the labour rights area and in governance. And those things are much harder to put metrics on. And so inevitably there's going to be a degree of kind of qualitative analysis that advisors are going to be doing. And I think this is actually where the role of the kind of trusted advisor as the lawyer, as counsel, really comes into its own.
You started your career as a barrister. So how did you make that transition into the ESG space?
I started lawyering. I came into the law as a generalist. You know, I started actually as a criminal, and then moved into sort of more commercial litigation, and then more broadly into kind of commercial law, and then moved into the ESG space. But I had a range of sort of interests and skills and experiences. You know, employment law, you know, commercial law, criminal and others. But you know, I very much saw the law as a sort of as a holistic thing, that it was good to learn all of these different things. And then we went down a very sort of specialist. Everyone wanted, you know, becoming more and more specialist, quicker and quicker in your career. I think to some extent it's sort of coming back now towards generalism. So you know, when you're talking about ESG, you've got to have a very broad set of antennae. You've got to have a political understanding. You've got to have an economic understanding. You've got to have an understanding of what the environmental movement is doing and how it's progressing. You've got to understand what commercial strategy looks like. All of this stuff, in addition to your core legal skills, are necessary.
What advice would you give lawyers who want to follow in those footsteps and move into a more ESG focused role?
It's now a serious career path. 15
yes, it is.
years ago, if you said you wanted to be a purpose-driven, social, environmental lawyer, well, there were a tiny number of positions available, and it was sort of seen as a bit of a backwater. Now it's very much in the mainstream. Everyone's talking about it. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there. It's a great career. It's a really rewarding thing to do, to work with and for organizations that want to change the world for the better. That's, I think most people I know, whether they're lawyers or not, would prefer to work with an organization that's doing that, right? So it's a really exciting thing to do. What I would say advice-wise would be, be prepared to take a broad view of the situation. Think strategically, be very forward-looking, be entrepreneurial. And this is the other thing about advisory practices nowadays, whether they're law firms or broader advisory practices, the PwCs of this world. I think what they're looking for are people who not just have the subject matter expertise, but are able to apply that in a really strategic and entrepreneurial way. Because working with their client base is much more now about being an integral part of the sort of C-suite and the strategy of the business, rather than just tell me what I can and can't do.
Thank you so much. That was really interesting. Any final thoughts today?
Just to say, I think we're at a really interesting moment in time here. Post-COVID, dare I say, post-Brexit, certainly post-financial crisis. All of these things are sort of weaving together. We're much more aware of the environmental crisis than we were even 5 years ago. And all of this is sort of is building up to quite an interesting moment. And for me, it's much more profound than just a change to this or that law. I think we're seeing a sort of revolutionary moment in how we view the economy. Because for 40 years or more, there's been this dominant paradigm that the state should do as little as possible, and that actually, it should be run more like a household. I think a lot of that's now being debunked, and we're seeing that governments can and should do big things, and companies are responding to that approach. And so, as lawyers, we've got to be very in tune with that and see that the world, is not going to survive just things being left to the market forever. It's going to have to take a much more sort of coherent approach to the political economy and the legal environment than we've had to date. But I think that's hugely exciting, and particularly for lawyers coming into the profession, seeing the way that the world is changing, and we are responding to those changes, and companies are responding to those changes, and hopefully they'll be doing it in time, so that we, whether it's energy transition, just transitions to a more sustainable economy, all of this stuff is at the core of what ESG must mean. And as advisors, we've got to be really clear about that direction and understand where it's going, and get in front of it and be, as inventive and innovative as we can be to help companies get where they're going.
Absolutely. James, thank you so much. You've been brilliant. We appreciate your advice and your thoughts and insight. Thank you so much, and hope to see you on another podcast soon.
Yeah, not at all. Thanks, Ben. Take care.